on a Friday morning. My name is Sissy Carroll. I'm your dean. I'm also a faculty member in secondary education and English education, which I seldom get to practice these days, so I'm delighted to have an opportunity to present to you one of my colleagues and dear friends, Dr. Kathy Froelich, who is a literacy education professor, a doctoral degree from Fordham University in literacy, language literacy and culture. And she will be addressing literacy, using literacy across the content areas. She's taught reading across the content areas and TESOL, or teaching English language learners across the content areas, for preparation of teachers in grades kindergarten through high school, for practicing teachers, pre-service teachers, teachers in the United States, has recently come back from Romania and Poland and other countries where her expertise has been drawn on from the Department of State of the United States of America. I apologize to those of you who don't have chairs, but I think Mitch is bringing in some more. You can just, move around and be comfortable as you can. Please make sure that your cell phones aren't going off during the presentation, because we are videotaping this. Our literacy faculty are at International Reading Association today, so that explains their absence, but we are videotaping because some of the faculty will be getting together later as a group with some other of our students and reviewing the presentation. Dr. Froelich often writes and has published these books, and has another one on the way with Dr. Enrique Pugh from University of Central Florida, where he directs the Moorridge International Center for Reading Research. And so she and Dr. Pugh are quite the team in writing and presenting on reading across the content area from that center. So without waiting much longer, and don't worry, you won't be bored, I can promise you. You will also leave with a copy of an article that includes a nice list of young adult literature to use across the content areas. So I think you'll find that really helpful. And we'll make other copies available online if we have run out. We have 50 copies, and I don't know how many of you are here. But we'll make other copies available online so you can pick those up. And Dr. Froelich's PowerPoint will also be available online. So you can get those. We'll send them to your instructors so you can get those online if that's okay. Okay? All right, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kathy.
The one thing that I didn't put up here that I just realized, of course, it's a learning curve and all approximations accepted, is my email address in case any of you need materials or anecdotes or shoulder to lean on. So email me at kfroelich at fsu.edu. That's probably the easiest way. Okay? And seriously, absolutely seriously, after 40 years of teaching, I find that one of the things that's really, really important to me is to be able to stay in touch with the people that I work with. Because that's what teaching is really about. It's not going in that classroom and closing the door and then saying, oh, well, I don't know why it didn't work. Okay? So today we're going to do a couple of things, and we're going to talk a little bit about theory, a little bit about practice, and a lot about literacy and why that's important to you as teachers. But first, let me have a show of hands. I need to know kind of where we are here. How many primaries? Primary, that would be in your world, 1-6, I guess, K-6, primary educators. Secondary? All right. Content area, English. Ooh. Math, anybody? Oh, math, my math people are so... Math people come to the literacy table a little differently than the rest. Any science people? Science, art, music, history, social sciences, perfect. And then we have that other, that tertiary group. Professors, graduate students, masters, foreign language, yes. My second love. English is a second language, people. So I've titled this ridiculous talk, Literacy Once and for All. Obviously all, meaning all of us, right? So let's just see what we've got. Who is all? Well, there's those fringe learners, and that's not Fringe, that movie. That's weird. We have struggling readers, gifted students, and ELL. Those are the people who are always the outliers. We always teach to the center, don't we? Or we're taught to teach to the center. But we got to think about those people too, and that's why I included everybody, because these people are the ones which we assume somebody else will take care of, right? Gifted teachers will take care of gifted, reading specialists will take care of reading, TESOL teachers will take care of the ELLs. Do you use ELL here as your primary English language learners? We dropped TESOL kind of or ESOL, because we know that a lot of these kids come with more than one language, so English wasn't their second language. It could have been their fourth language or their fifth language. Okay? So this is who we're talking about. Let's talk about this. At Florida State University, when I arrived, your dean was my chair. Yeah, that's right. And they had a class that was called Content Reading. And in that class, students read. That is all. So we tried to think of it in terms of what was going on, what was changing about the profession, the area, and to see where we could move this to better serve teachers who were going to move that into the classroom. So we asked students what they thought about this. And if you get a chance and you want a copy of the article that Dean Carroll was talking about, this describes that process pretty well. They did a study in our classroom, our content reading classroom. What wasn't working? Why wasn't it working? What could we do? And then we looked at what the faculty thought about that course too, and they thought, well, you know, math people don't need it, because everybody knows nobody reads math. Which seemed a bit odd to me, but then I'm odd. So they thought that the class should be just for elementary teachers and anybody that was going to teach reading. So maybe second language learners, teachers of second language learners would do that, but they weren't quite sure even about that. So we had to come up with a new design. So we started looking at using authentic text. Now when you're in your classrooms, do you talk about the difference between primary text, authentic text, text that really work with kids, as opposed to textbooks? Yeah. Maybe I won't get into the textbook argument. All right, and then this is just by way of the course itself, and one of the strongest things I wanted to do was to introduce literacy modeling. So I wanted to design the course for them that they would teach. So I wanted the course to model, I wanted me to model what I wanted them to go out and do. And pretty much that's what I'm going to do for you today. Because I believe, it's my strongest belief, is that our best way of teaching is through modeling, not through just telling, opening up your head, pouring information in, right? We are see and do people. That's why we start in kindergarten with what? What's that little thing everybody does on Friday in kindergarten? Any of you go to kindergarten? How about show and tell? Remember that? We always forget that. We always think after kindergarten you don't need show and tell anymore. But you do. Do you know there's we used to use these a lot. I don't know if they do anymore. The big book concept. And I took those into a high school. And the high school students went, ooh. But in about 20 nanoseconds, they were hooked. They wanted their teacher to read to them every Friday. She didn't like me very much after that. And the other thing I thought was really important for our undergraduates and our graduate students was to understand that notion of learning theory. If you are in a classroom and you're doing something that some consultant told you to do, but didn't tell you why, and it doesn't work, what do you want to do? You want to kill the consultant, shoot the consultant, right? Shoot the messenger. But if you know why it doesn't work, then you know what to change. And you don't need somebody to come in and tell you, look, this is how you should be running your classroom, which is also a critically important part for me. I was a classroom teacher for 28 years, and then 12 years I have at the college, university level. All right, so then what happened? This all took about a year to evolve. We taught 4 sections of the content reading class the first year that this was going on, and then in the summer, late summer, we started rolling out this new model. So it was kind of a nice way to do it too, because we had a little bit smaller group of people, so it worked out pretty well. So we started moving from thinking about it as content reading to content literacy, or literacy across the content areas, the way it finally evolved. And that was a critical change in vocabulary for everybody, because it wasn't just about reading, which it never has been, right? It's never been about reading. All right, so we also changed the textbooks. We started reading real, authentic text, and we started developing posters as proof of our knowledge, which you guys are doing some poster stuff down in one of the classes I was in yesterday. It's kind of nice, and I'll show you some results of that in a minute. But the kids were required to come in and read. I read every class period aloud. We used the giver. That was the first one. And then groups were assigned, and the students had to choose a book of in their subject area, and they had a group presentation and by proof of poster about this book. And my favorite student in the whole world, Frank, came to me after the first class and said, Dr. Froelich, no offense, I don't read chapter books. I said, Frank, you're a junior in college. I don't read chapter books. I don't want to read chapter books. I've never read one. I'm not going to have to do it in my job. I said, well, Frank, this is going to be a real steep learning curve for both of us, because you're going to read a chapter book. So at the end of this course, of course, he came in, he said to me, this has changed my life. I love them. But it was a whole different way of thinking about reading. He wasn't, see the dog run. That was reading chapter books to him, Dick and Jane. So it really was an eye-opening experience for all of us. Here's one of them. This is one of the posters from The Watchmen. So they do a presentation, but then they give you a visual. This will be in the PowerPoint, so you don't have to take time to read it. But it is kind of interesting. They have 4 components that they have to include, and then they can include anything else they want to. Right? So they have to talk about the author. They have to talk about the purpose of the poster. They have to talk about the teaching strategies and implications for further study. So for instance, if they were in their classroom and the students wanted to read, their high school seniors wanted to read Watchmen, what would those students do to create this poster for further use? What other kinds of texts would they read? Right? So they're not just thinking about the book they're reading, but how does it connect or go with other things? Some of them went so far as to do it in other contents. For instance, English language arts and history, science and math. So they would coordinate different texts that go with other subject areas. All right? Here's another one from Tangerine by Edward Bloor. Do you know this book? This is a great little book. Our disability students for visual disabilities use this book a lot. In Florida, I don't know if it's this way here, but in Florida, everybody who teaches, wants to teach, or work in schools in any capacity has to take a literacy class, a reading class, and also ELL, second language learning. So everybody is in our content classes. Everybody. Is that the same way here? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah. We have music, art, speech therapy, school psychology, librarians, PE. You think it's hard to teach math people? Try to teach PE people. Where do they read? I said, are you always on the field? another whole story. So anyway, so that's Tangerine, and this is their poster description. And there's their purpose statement, teaching statement, teaching continued, and then implications for further study. Now, as technology evolved with us, a lot of them do these online. They do through Prezi or Animoto, or some of them did YouTube presentations. They reenacted their stories and did it that way. So anything was available to them. I didn't have any structure except those 4 components. They could do it in any way they felt was appropriate for the text and for their group and their teaching. So there's one from this one. Do you know the invention of Hugo Cabret? This was this was a mixed group, because we only had a couple of art people and a couple of speech pathologists in this group. And so they got together and did this. And you can't really tell, this is a beautiful poster. This is styrofoam. And these doors open up that give you the information for the teaching and the purpose statement. It's quite beautiful. Here's one for the number devil math people. I was telling somebody yesterday in the class that there's a great book called Flatland and Flatlander. It's really hard, and we actually had 2 really dynamic posters, but I couldn't find them. But if you are interested, I'll try to dig them out of my archives and send you how they did them. They're really good. All right, so this is the components. This is all they had to do, and they could do anything else they wanted to. They could do it on a hard contact board. They could do it by electronics. It didn't matter.
So
all right,
Dr.
so
Froelich,
shift. Question.
When the, say, a mathematics education group is in your content literacy class, and they do a project around numbers of stars or something, and then, I mean, the idea is for them to realize as prospective teachers of math, how they can incorporate reading and writing and thinking into their teaching of mathematics content.
Right.
But also weaving in literacy and making sure they're addressing the needs of language learners with special needs, just using literacy as part of the delivery of their content.
Yes.
Right? So they present that to their other classmates who may be teaching social studies or English or
PE.
French. And those students can go, whoa, I've never thought about using a text that way, so they can use those ideas in their content areas too.
Absolutely. Oh, that reminds me. I'd like for you to stop when you have questions and ask right away. Wait until the end. And I don't even know if I said that, you know. So if you've got questions, you can stop and just raise your hand. All right, so one of the things I thought was missing from a really important and good course for people who are going to teach literacy across the content area was to understand the structure of how a literacy program should work in your classroom. And here's the caveat. I'm not talking about elementary only. I'm talking about every classroom. So if we talk about balanced literacy, because I know some people have that notion that there's something wrong with whole language, that term we used in the 80s. I have a problem with that because whole language means what?
All those aspects of it.
All.
Everything.
I don't understand what was wrong when, and believe me, I sat through the reading wars through both sides of it at conventions when all of us would cower in our seats except the 2 teams that were throwing bombs at each other. And that's a bad term to use today. But whole language to us that were in the trenches meant we used every aspect of everything we could to get kids to love reading and to be good at it. That's what that meant. It didn't mean that you as a teacher could not do the Fab Five, or the Super Six now, and we'll go on that a little bit. You didn't get to just sit back and make hair appointments or worry about your real estate holdings while everybody else just kind of absorbed knowledge. But there were people that did that, right? But there are people who do that now. So to blame it on the term whole language, to me, seemed a bit foolish. But, okay, so if it makes you happier, I'll call it balanced literacy, which it really is. So as you're here again, you're picking from anything that works for that student. You get a student who comes in as already a reader, you're not going to drill that person in phonics. You get a second language learner coming in, or somebody you know is a struggling reader, you're going to do something to find out what their phonemic awareness base is, how strong they are in phonics. Even as high school teachers, you get a struggling reader, you get somebody who's can't read Shakespeare, you have to figure out what to do about that. With those high school students, I still do a running record. Any of you in here understand about running records? Have you learned that in your reading class? I'll send you some docs, English people. It's the quickest way for you to get to understand literally how what skills they're using and not using in reading. Because trust me, if they can't read, guess what? There's nothing you can do. If they hate reading because they're not good at it, they're not going to want to read. And if they're not auditory learners, you are out of luck. You are off the page. All right. So what is it? Well, in my world, it means you start with things like read aloud. You know what a read aloud is? Everybody does it. I heard something on NPR the other day. This person, I've forgotten who the author was, but he was saying how important it was for teachers to be able to read aloud. But he says, if you're not good at it, don't do it. My thing is practice. Read aloud to your peers. Because that's the strongest, that's the way you're going to become the strongest at it. Because if you can read to your peers and move them, then you can read to anybody. But I also find that with little kids, and especially middle grade kids, who think, you know, nothing faces me. You can stand up and read, but try not reading on a Friday after you've gotten them hooked into a Jerry Spinelli story. Oh, you'd think the world had collapsed. So you start with the read aloud. Then we also use something called shared reading. How many of you remember how you learned to read? You do? Good. How many? Nobody up back there remembers? How old were you when you learned to read? 5, 6? I guess maybe you weren't. My guess is you were probably 1 or 2, unless you were raised like that little guy that was raised by wolves. Because if your parents read to you, or older siblings read to you, you were introduced to text long before you actually knew how to call the words. So that shared reading experience, that thing you do when you sat next to your parents, right? Or your older siblings, or your grandma, your grandpa, right? That thing you do introduced you to literacy. We know that the kids that come to us that have those experiences, are 2,000 hours plus ahead of those kids that don't. Now you're talking about what happens in kindergarten plus 2,000, or minus 2,000 if you're the glass half empty. And you're the teacher that's getting that child in the 4th, the 5th, the 6th grade. What do you think that child is capable of doing? Unless they have just miraculously reinvented themselves. Right? They don't have schema. They don't have vocabulary. They probably have receptive vocabulary, probably strong, but not interactive vocabulary. Right? By the time they get to you as a 5-year-old. So by the time they get to a middle school teacher, they are so far behind that many of them do just give up. They just feel so disenfranchised from the system, there's nothing they can do. I can't read. I don't want to read. I don't want anybody to even talk to me about reading. Right? It's been such a hateful experience for them. They see a book and they just want to jump out of a window. You can't really blame them. All right, so we need that shared experience. So if you've got kids that you want them to read, let's see, what are we reading now at the middle grade in a textbook? Anybody know? English teachers? Oh, say you want them to read a science report from your textbook, or, you know, you're doing all that content, right? Second language learners. Say you want to read a science report. So you want them to see what good reading is about, right? So you read aloud while they follow in the text. You're modeling what good readers do. Do good readers always read the first time perfectly? Well, not unless you're reading a grocery list. Potatoes, tomatoes, you know. So it's okay to make mistakes too. All right. So that's what we want to do there. We want to have read aloud, we want to have shared reading, and then we want to have that opportunity for teaching, which is guided reading. That's that third really important thing. That's where you take those skill-specific things that students need and you plug them in together in small groups and say, okay, I'm going to teach you. So as an English teacher, and the science teachers and the math teachers, that might not work for you because you might not have that time. But you've taken the time to do those first couple of things so you know if they can't pattern a math problem. They can't track a math problem. They can't figure out what the key elements of a math problem are, right? So then you can work with them one-on-one. English, history, science, you can do the same kinds of things. You take those small groups and you say, okay, is it vocabulary that you're not getting? We can highlight that. Is it the sentence structure? Is it a new kind of reading that we're not sure about? What do we need to do? So you can pattern your teaching. You can specifically target the most important things. It is a really good way of using your time most effectively. Now, a lot of us think that the teaching, you're supposed to stand at a lecture like this for, I don't know, 180 days times 40 years. I can't imagine anything more boring. I've already hit this trance about 16 times and we're not even in here about 30 minutes. I can't honestly understand. I couldn't follow somebody that stood still all the time and just regurgitated information to me. That's not the way I learn. There are kids that learn that way, but they can also be trained to learn in a variety of ways. Kinesthetic, auditory, and visual. All right, so we have read aloud, we have shared reading, we have guided reading. And then we have that all-important thing that our colleague, Dr. Donald Graves, used to think was totally absent from classrooms, and that was independent reading. The time to explore on your own those texts which you choose. We forget about that in school too, because we're under the gun to be page 32 by March 4th at 12:06. You know, it's just, it really seems like learning is the last thing that we follow from teaching, and everything else goes before that. All right, so you'd want to do this also in writing. Gosh, there's a heady thing. We write in math? Oh, yes, we write in math. I don't know how you not. So you want to have some kind of, it's not called write aloud in math, obviously, even though in Florida we do call that, what's that thing they used to say? Oral language development? Oral language. And it wasn't oral language, it was written on the board. And the kids corrected the information, and then they sent the teacher their booklet that had the correct format. It was usually something about grammar. But you want to model writing for them. So English teachers, heads up. That doesn't mean come in prepared with a 10-page script that you typed up and proofread the night before. That's not how writing happens, does it? How many of you are writing a paper right now? Me too. I'm writing a book. I'm slogging through this book. It's really more like it. Writing is a messy, chaotic process. And kids are very frustrated when the teacher hands them a book and it says, this is an essay. Now you're going to write one. Not me. I'm going to do everything I can but write it. I'm going to do the laundry, pack a lunch, whatever I can do, I'm doing other than writing, because I have no clue where I'm going with this. So it's really important for you to come in and model. Start out talking about your day. You know, if you wanted to do a poem, write a poem. Show them how a poem works. If you're doing haiku, show them. Don't show them a picture of it. Show them how you would do it. I was in a kindergarten class in Pocatello, Idaho. It's the same place with the library lady. And we did this little thing. I did this writing thing, and I was writing along and not paying attention, and this little kid raised her hand. She said, "What is that thing over there?" And I said, that's what we call here a period. Some countries they call it a full stop. It means your whole thought stops right there. She goes, "I could use those." Okay. I hope you will. Even kindergarten kids get it. You know, I mean, we think that, oh gosh, they're just kindergarten, they're never. But if you don't introduce them to fourth grade, look at all the wasted opportunities, right? So model for them. Same thing with collaborative writing is shared writing. So the class and I create a story together. We create the essay together. We create the science report. We create the math report, right? We did a study on the amount of waste in the cafeteria and how much it was going to cost, and we wanted to write a report. That's what we do. So, and then you have that same thing. You have the guided writing experience, so that you work with a small group. What's not working in your paragraphs? You know, what do you need to change? Here's another great story. I'm full of them. Class in New York City, teachers being videotaped like what's going on here. And she is trying to do this guided writing thing with this student who's written a beautiful, beautiful little report about a black motorcycle reminding him of a black horse, and his father rides a black motorcycle, and he's gotten all caught up in the imagery of the horse and the motorcycle, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes off on a little tangent about in the middle, which is probably typical of 4th and 5th graders. They just kind of wander off. So the teacher is playing to the camera. "Son, this is a great story. But right here, what do you think is going on?" And he stops and he reads it. Then he looks at her. She goes, "Well, do you see anything you might want to change?" "No." So she persists. "Well, if I read this, then what am I likely to understand about this?" "It's about my dad. It's about his motorcycle. Don't you get it?" And she tried one more time. Finally, he just said, "It's my story." Now, what was he saying to her? I'm not ready, right? I'm not ready to go there. This is still where the story is. And that's okay, too, if it's his story. If it's your story, then you need to tell him that ahead of time, that you want only 3 paragraphs and it's got to have these sentences, right? But it was a perfect guided writing opportunity, because she could have pointed out, you know, sentence structure. She could have pointed out vocabulary issues or punctuation. Never more than 1 or 2, we're told, because they can't really accommodate all of that. The other thing is, when you do history essays and English essays and those kinds of things, and you spend a voluminous amount of time bleeding red ink all over those pages, guess what the research says? It doesn't work. You have wasted your time. If you send notes that say, "This is a really good story, but you need to really work on structure," you're better off. Or, "You've really got some issues, you're using vocabulary in here that's not appropriate for this story, you've misused blah, 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 or you've got punctuation issues, blah, blah, blah," you're better off. Send them off to find out what's wrong with it themselves. It's time consuming, I know, but we've got to slow the clock down. We've got to let education happen instead of, what's that other word? Uneducation, which is really what it is, because if you're covering everything and learning nothing, you really might as well have stood still, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Questions so far? There'll be a quiz at 11:30.
I was wondering, how can we best then work with the timeline that we're given by our schools and the districts? How do we use that time?
It's a brilliant question. Lucky for you, when you're going through it, there'll be less and less of those kinds of things. I mean, you're going to have Common Core standards, which I looked at them, and honest to goodness, they're certainly a lot better than some of the other things that we had to work with. And the flexibility you'll have to work with those is a lot better. We're starting to come around. Even Bill and Melinda Gates have now come out with their study that said, you know, we shouldn't tie test scores to teacher performance and da, da, da. So, you know, I figure next year everybody's going to get a 10% raise. You know, if Bill and Melinda Gates said it, must be true, right? We've only been saying it for 40 years. You know, that quality is better than quantity. And that's really what we're talking about here. But do I expect that you're going to go out and become the Maury Clay guru of the English language classroom? I'm not sure. I hope you do. I always found, and this is, you know, just one example, that when I tried to incorporate as many things as I could, given the time constraints, given that I have to use a textbook that I couldn't use, bless your heart, then I was better off. I at least was able to accommodate the kids that are what we talked about, the fringe. I could better accommodate them because there's a group in your classroom that are going to get it whether you're there or not. You know that, don't you? They don't really need you. They just are required to come to class. So really and truly, if you're working to the audience, you're working to the fringe. You should be, because those are the kids that really need you the most. The rest of them will love you too, and I think that's important for you. Is everybody awake?
Yeah.
All right. So you have those three components on each side. So you have it for reading and writing, and you have it across the content areas. So, like I said, you try to do what you can do. You can't obviously do everything for everybody at all times. You are good, but you're not that good. I mean, I'm a good example of a bad example. You know, I try to do as much as I can, and sometimes you are thwarted in your efforts to do as much by doing less. You know, less than you thought you were doing. All right, and then there's their whole notion about evaluation and assessment, which everybody, the whole word of assessment makes people kind of, you know, cringe and do one of those things. But I think there are two things going on here. And my colleagues and I are kind of unique in that because people still see those words as being the same thing. That if I'm doing assessment in a classroom, I'm also doing evaluation. That's not true. If it were, they would be spelled the same, first of all. They're not. Evaluate is just that, value, right? So evaluation in my world is what I look for in my classroom that tells me I've been successful. So I might look at the posters. I might look at the lesson plans, you know, or I might look at performance assessment, something that the kids are doing that shows me what I'm teaching is making sense. It's working for them, right? As opposed to assessment, which is the way I let the kids know what they're doing. They get a test or they get a poster presentation, and we assess that. We do some self-assessments and those kinds of things, that's another whole workshop. So the two things are not. You might look at assessments to inform your practice, right? But the kids are not, unless they evaluate you. That's a little bit different. So the two things are different. I need to feedback. And for a lot of my classes, I get feedback every day. So I might get feedback from listening to small group instruction, which is in the class yesterday, the tech class yesterday. There was a lot of that going on all the time. The people that were doing their teaching were walking around and they were giving feedback, and the people were telling them. And so they were getting information about how the class was working and what things they needed to fill in to make sure everybody was on the right page and doing well. The whole point, of course, is doing well. It's not getting through class, it's doing well, right? And that doesn't mean getting a grade necessarily. It means learning what you need to learn to be successful in the world. And for me, that's literacy. Okay? All right, then how do we learn? Anybody want to jump in there? That's a kind of a 20-foot ditch. But jump in. We've been jumping in now in my career, 40 years. People keep saying, oh, how do we learn to do that? Or
We do it.
go ahead.
By doing it.
Yes, do by doing. Well, isn't that kind of anathema to school?
Often.
Usually we think doing is by listening to me tell you what to do. Right? But we know that's not what it is. Brian Camborne. If you haven't been introduced to Brian Camborne, I recommend him highly. He wrote a little book called The Whole Story in 1991, and he talks about these things. That all of us, in everything we learn, this is the system we use. It's recursive. It doesn't mean that you first do one. I'm not going to touch the board. I'm going to lean at it. You don't just do this, 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 in this sequence. It's recursive, right? We might do a little this. I might have to go back, right? So what do you think immersion means in a learning environment?
Jumping into the whole
Say it out.
Jumping into the whole situation.
Yes, it's having a lot of the whole situation too. Donald Graves, that I spoke of earlier, he did a study across the country and on reading time in the classrooms. Found that in an average hour of so-called reading, guess how much time they spent reading? Individually, not as a choral read or whatever, but individually.
5 minutes.
Close, 8.
Yeah.
How do you learn to read in 8 minutes?
Read fast.
Right. So if you're immersed in the process, you're better off, right? You see reading, you hear reading, you watch reading, you're immersed in the process. And there are an infinite variety of ways in which you can do this. You're not just looking at a textbook, and now we, of course, know that it's iPads and screens and all kinds of things. Florida is just mandated by the year 2015, no textbooks in the classrooms. Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Right. We talked about this yesterday because some teachers, and rightly so, have some trepidations about this because I'm a visual learner. And it's not always on my iPad that I get things. I have a Kindle. I like reading on it when I'm on an airplane, but I find that sometimes I go back and buy the book and reread it. I don't know whether that's because I was raised in the paper era, but there's something sometimes I don't get when I'm looking at something visually. Being slightly ADHD, that may be some of it too. All right, but you need to be immersed in the process. You need approximations. We talked about this before. How many of you, well, does everybody in here drive a car or ride a bicycle? Raise your hand if you learned to do it the first time perfectly. This is another one of those great stories. My mother learned to drive after she was 30-something years old. We had to allow her a lot of approximations. Bless her heart. She just never got that thing driving. She just couldn't do it. Approximations means you allow kids to make mistakes. That's as simple as that. You allow them the room to explore. I was saying this to Dean Carroll yesterday. I said, you know, in education, the only thing is when we try and practice and fail, we're a bunch of idiots. When science tries and practices and fails, they're geniuses. Try again. It's only in education we have to be perfect the first time. Well, your students, that carries over to your students too. So you need to kind of allow them the space to say, well, you're close. What could you do differently? What could you add to that will make it a little better, make it a stronger story, make it a better math problem, right? How did you get those points in there? It's one of the things I found on Common Core that I really like. They ask you to explore your areas, explore the ways in which you got your answer, not just what the answer is. It's great stuff. All right, we talked about modeling. We don't need to go through that. He calls it demonstrations, where you get up and show everything. This one is my favorite, expectations. Studies showed us that teacher expectation is the strongest motivator in your classroom. There was a study in Illinois that they took a bunch of kids and they put them in a classroom and they told the teacher, these are all C-, D, and F students. They took another group of kids, put them in the classroom, another teacher. These are all A+ students. These are gifted students. At the end of their first 9-week marking period, guess what? The A+ students were A+ students, the C, D, and Fs were the C, D, and Fs. Guess where they really were? It was just the opposite. And the teacher expected them to be in that stage. That's where they were. That's where they stayed. They will either learn down to you or learn up to you. And I find that to be very, very true. Teacher expectation. But there's also this notion as a teacher that I want the students to expect that they can learn. I got mine. I want you to be able to learn. I want you to think that you are capable of learning and will. So it's a very, very important thing. And then I want you to take the responsibility for that. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to pick up after you. Right? I'm not going to tell you how many times your homework is due. I'm not going to tell you how many times what your homework is. You have to be responsible. You have to want to do it. And here again, I'm a good example of a bad example, have taken away their notion of learning responsibility. Oh, I'll call your mother later and tell her you've got 2 pages for homework tonight, and blah, blah, blah. And now it's even worse because now we email everybody. Right? Don't worry, you don't have to be responsible till 6:04 tonight, and you can do 2 pages of homework. But somebody will remind you again. Well, we took little kids in Naperville, Illinois, and gave them diaries, little journal things, and made them write everything down. We made little CEOs of everybody. But it was wonderful because they expected that they would get the work done. Mom was less agitated at the end of the day. And so were they. Because they had it, it was organized for them, they could do it. Okay. So then there's that notion of practice. Once again, go back to Donald Graves. They only read 8 minutes out of an hour. They weren't practicing reading very much, were they? So what were their chances of being successful readers? Slim and none, we say in Florida. If you don't read and don't write, you can't be successful. You have to be able to do it. You can't read 2 sentences and popcorn to the next person and be thought of as someone who's going to be successful at that unless you're already reading. And then you're probably just bored and you just want to, pull your hair out and go to the junior store and have a Slurpee or something. Ridiculous. All right, so we want to practice a lot. And in English, that means them talking and not you. In history, it means them talking and not you. In TSL up there in the corner, that means them talking. I know that's the last thing they want to do, but that's what it means. They have to start doing that too. All right, and the last thing is response. There must be some way for them to be able to respond to what they've done. So do you want them to do some kind of performance response, some kind of written response, but there should be some kind of feedback, some kind of response. All right? And it needs to be appropriate feedback. Do you know what the difference between a feedback and appropriate feedback? Mm-hmm. Here's the kid who says, Mom, there goes a tuck. And she says, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Go sit in the closet, don't talk the rest of the day. Well, that's feedback, but it's not appropriate feedback. So if a kid's made an approximation, an error, a mistake, you don't go, that's so stupid, and walk off. You say, how did you get there? What kinds of things were you thinking about? Or had you thought about X? So you're giving them feedback that they're not correct. You're not doing what they call the namby-pamby approach, which is, oh, you'll get to it later. You're telling them it's not quite accurate, but you're not saying you're the stupidest thing on the planet. Because especially with second language learners and struggling readers, when that happens to them, they get lopped off. They're not coming back. You can't stand up and let them speak with an accent and say that's stupid and let people laugh at them because they're not going to want to speak again. Right? Same thing with struggling readers. You call on a struggling reader to read, they respond by wanting to. They do. Everyone I've ever had wanted to read. And I was a reading teacher for 132 million years. They want to read, but they don't want to be laughed at. I don't want to be laughed at. Well, sometimes I do. I don't want to be laughed at when I'm reading. Right? So you got to just support them. Well, that's a good try. Let's think about this. Let's try it again. Easy, right? Expectations, everything. Of course, and if you don't expect them to be able to do it, and you think it's going to set them off, don't call on them. Call on somebody else. If they raise their hand and want to be, call on them. All right, and Brian says that when all of this happens, kids are engaged. What is the one thing that we talk about now in education that is lacking in schools? Motivation. Well, that's what he calls engagement. So if all these things are happening, if they are in the process, if they're immersed in it, if they are practicing, if they are thinking about it, if they're getting appropriate feedback, if they're seeing strong models, when all of those things are happening to them, they're engaged. They want to learn. They want to explore how that plant develops, right? They want to explore why economics is failing everybody in the United States. You know, they are engaged in the process. They'll be engaged in your classroom. You won't be able to contain them half the time. Okay, questions about the conditions for learning? We're going to skip Vygotsky today. I saw half of you already apparently know about Mr. Vygotsky. All right, some truths about reading. Oh, question.
I'm glad that you mentioned the expectation. When I interact with students with different cultural backgrounds, I noticed that if you have students of color, for example, I deal with several Native American students, for graduate students, and then when I listen to their educational experiences, they report that they were never asked to go to like college prep courses. You know, teachers automatically say, okay, you're native. Well, teachers do not say it, but counselors assume that, okay, you'd better go to some voc ed track rather than college prep.
Absolutely true.
And also the Asian American community, you know, stereotypes are stereotypes. There is no positive or negative stereotypes. So some kids are...
You mean all Asian students aren't geniuses?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right? So kind of wrong stereotypes about very good at math and science. They left out so many kids who are struggling in math and science. So I wonder how you can combine the diversity issue with the notion of expectation.
Well, when I work with student teachers, I tell them to avoid the teacher's lounge and avoid cumulative folders. That's the first thing they need to do. It's not that I want you to never to look at the cumulative folder, but if you look at them first, it's there. Somebody else's idea of what you are and what you should be is there. It's not my formed opinion, because I don't know you yet, but yet you can't help it because you've read who they are or who somebody thinks they are, correct?
Yeah.
So you go in prepared thinking, it's like that study. They go in prepared to think that these are all A students and these are not. So their expectations work on that dimension. They can't help it. You're a human being. You've already read it. So I tell student teachers, don't be contaminated by it. Don't read cum folders until after you get to know the kids. Go in, talk about yourself, then ask them to talk about themselves, ask them to write a sample for you, go home, explore that sample, find out what kinds of things they like, what their cultural expectations are for that class. Right? Where do you see yourself in this class? Find out about your students. We don't do that at the university level very much either. We start out with the textbook, day one. You know, it's like that old model, and we still carry it on in our classrooms. Instead of stopping that first day and taking a huge deep breath and saying, okay, what are we about here? I start out my second language learner class with stereotypes. Write down who you think you are culturally, socially, psychologically. Who are you? What cultural group do you identify with? Right? And then we explore all of those things and what brought us to the table, the good and the bad. What are some stereotypes you've heard about Jewish people that are negative? And I write mine on the board like everybody else writes theirs, right? No, we're not all after everybody's money. We don't own all the banks in the world, right? We're not dirty. I took a bath just this morning. Okay? But stereotypes are a really hard thing for people to talk about and face, and we don't really understand how ingrained some of them are, right? In one of my classes, one of the young women said, I feel I can't talk in this class or in class, not my class, in classes because of my faith. Now, you would think that that wouldn't have anything to do with how people, but she perceived herself as a strong, faithful person, and that was the first thing she projected, and she saw people pushing back against that. So, you know, it's a very simple thing to do. Wait to open your textbooks until after you know your students. Yes, it's important. It's a very important thing. All right, great statement question, thank you. Reading is the basis on which all academic learning is predicated. Who does not believe that? And if you don't, we're going to have lunch together. Seriously, folks, you don't read, and now it's even more complicated because all the different kinds of things you read. Somebody said to me, well, wait a minute, what about visually impaired? Did they read signs? Do you know the study of semiotics? You know what that is? That's a study of signs and symbols, which is really, technically reading falls under that. Umberto Eco wrote a really great paper on it if you're interested, grad students. It's a little dense, but it's good. He's good. He also wrote a great novel called The Naming of the Rose, about 16th century monks who one was more ambitious than he should have been and figured out some way to get some poisons in the letters on the stuff he was translating, you know, because only the monks could write. It's a great story. All right, so we don't do anything unless we can read. Even if we need to read body language or stop signs or whatever, we need that for academic success. Learning to read requires strong models. Learning to read requires a self-improving system. And it's not one that you hold the hand of the person for the next 18 years and move on. They need it. It's a self-improving system. And that requires self-direction. I want to read. So I'm going to skip two of these. Let's see. Self-motivation and the one that self-regulation, where I know I'm making mistakes. I might not know what to do about it, but I know it's not right. So I'll figure out a system to go back and find a way to correct that. Do you know when you read, I don't even know if I've done this, but when you're reading, you don't read words. Do you all accept that as a foundational premise? You read pictures. If you don't have a strong schema, for instance, if I say snow, right? You say snow. It snows here, right? We even have a little snow in North Florida. Yeah. But if I say snow, everybody has a kind of an idea, a picture in your head. What happens? Some people have more elaborate pictures. They see a snowstorm and people slogging, and they see all these kinds of things. Well, or you just see little flakes, right? Well, that's not true in Alaska. You have to describe the snow. There are 42 words for it. It's very important. But if you're a struggling reader and you only have no picture of snow, you are from Miami Beach, right? You're off the page. You can't possibly understand. So it's important to have what I call deep schema for reading. And once that happens, you have these robust pictures, you know, kind of like when you read, how many people read Harry Potter? Any of the Harry Potter? Oh my goodness. You become part of the text, don't you? You like it so much, you understand it, you are in the book. You're not a character in the book, but you are in the book. So you can read for hours and you can start at daylight and it'll be dark and you won't even know it. Right? Just like going to the movies. It's a very important thing. All right, so then learning to read requires the acquisition of these things. This is what we call the Super Six. Right? You need strong phonemic awareness. What is that? Is that the same thing as phonics? I told you this is going to be a quiz. No. Phonemic awareness is the ability to hear the sounds, not see them, not read them off the page, but hear them. It's an auditory skill. We also know that that is the foundational element for strong readers. If you have a strong phonemic awareness base, you're a strong reader. Okay? If you don't, and we know this is what happens with struggling readers, you will not be successful as a reader until that situation is clarified until you have established phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is simply if I say act. All of you in this room are geniuses, and you knew that I wasn't saying snowboard. Correct? Yes. Right. Because you're brilliant. Right? Or if I said dog, I could ask you to give me the elements in that word, and you would not say snail. You would say good. All right, so the phonemic awareness is very important. You need phonics, right? That's the ability to see it on the page and call it. Different than hearing it, somebody saying it to you and calling it and knowing what it is. So you need phonics. Nowhere in the whole language manifesto did it say, do not teach phonics ever again. It's a stupid thing. Nowhere. I've looked at all the documents. I've asked all the people that were responsible, and no one or no thing has ever pointed out that you cannot use phonics. You have to. It's part of the package. All right, you need a strong vocabulary. Now, some people say that from K1, 2, you're learning to read, and then 3 to forever, you're reading to learn. And it's a basic principle, but it's pretty true. So those foundational things, phonemic awareness, phonics, and building blocks for vocabulary are really, really important. This is especially true when kids come to you with limited experiential backgrounds. Right? I had kids that came to school from their car. They didn't go to museums. They didn't go to the libraries. They didn't have library cards. They went from the school to their car and maybe McDonald's. You know, they came to school to eat. They came to school to take a shower in the gym. That was the extent of their lives, right? So it was left up to me to fill in the blanks. It's not a pretty picture, but it's the only picture they have. So we can try to make it as palatable as we can for them. All right, so vocabulary is important. Fluency. Now see, in my world, fluency means the correct tone, tenor, and tempo, those 3 T things. Doesn't mean you have just rate of reading, right? So it means a little more. If I'm reading an insurance document, I guarantee you I'm not laughing. Or a law document. However, if I'm reading Alexander McCall Smith, who as I am these days, I'm laughing hysterically. I get the tenor and the tone of the text, right? I read at the appropriate rate. How many of you are in schools now and are working with students? Or have worked with students? You know, you get those kids that read the boy ran across the road. Well, he's reading the spaces still. That's the level of the phase where that student still is. He's reading the word, and the space becomes a word. That's one of the ways we know that. That's one of the first stages for second language learners. They read still read the spaces. So if he's reading a Dick and Jane book and it's like little sentences, maybe that's appropriate rate. But my guess is that because he's reading the spaces, he's not understanding, he's losing the concept of the text anyway, so it's not an appropriate rate. So you need those 3 things. So fluency requires that you monitor that they're reading with the appropriate tone, tenor, voice, and tempo. Okay? And then the last thing, of course, which is obviously not as important as anything else. Come on, guys. Let's go. We're almost there. Got a few more minutes. Comprehension. Why are you reading? You're just reading to kind of pass the time. I don't need to make any sense of this. What? You know, I don't care. I just want to hear you read the words. If you can read the words, you're good. Do you believe that?
No.
No. Thank goodness. You people in Oklahoma are so forward. I'm so impressed. We're still working on that in Florida. We haven't got that comprehension thing down yet. Because there are people out there who still believe that if you just call the words, you're reading. I can teach a parent to call the words. Does the parent, maybe the parent understands more than I think. Okay. That is the reason you read. To come away from the text thinking and feeling something different, right? Otherwise, don't waste your time. Right? Good. All right. So those are really, really important. If you don't have those incorporated into your program and you've got struggling readers, I suggest you find texts that do. And teaching strategies, which I can send you a whole bunch of different kinds of teaching strategies that develop these things, okay, for all ages. So you just email me. All right, then we have these protocols, these domains. You know about these? So does everybody know about these, or do I need to just quickly go over this? Semantic domain is your understanding, making meaning, right? Your graphophonic, notice there's two things there. It doesn't say your phonic domain. Because your phonic domain would be your hearing. You're not doing that.
No.
If you're looking at a word on the page, it's grapho. Thank you. It's so simple to me, but maybe I'm missing something. All right, then your syntactic domain is the lexical grammatical one. You need that one. Two, you need to understand where in second language, depending on the second language, the verb may go precedes. In our language, it doesn't. You need to know those kinds of things. Kids know that. They learn very quickly how to filter out. That's what the brain does, you know. You're born with the capacity to understand all languages that are on the face of the earth today, that are spoken. But because you don't hear them, they're not modeled to you. You eliminate those sounds, right? You eliminate the structure of that language. That's why for us old guys, it's really hard to learn new languages. But for little kids, it's an easier thing to do. That doesn't mean that it's easier for them to learn to read and write in those languages, but to speak them, all right? It's up to us to then further develop it. The last one, which to me, again, is one of the most important one. It goes back to that notion of schema, is the pragmatic domain. That means that I understand the context in which something is said, read, whatever. For instance, second language learners again, hold the phone. Literally, that's what they think. The first time I said that, they were all kind of, and I said, hold the phone. They went, I don't see a phone. No, right? So it's important to understand the pragmatic domain. How do I want you to interpret what I'm saying? Do you ever think about signs on the road for second language learners? Boots, half off. Why would you want a half a boot? Jumbo shrimp. Shirts laundered on hangers. I love signs. This is just a few. And these are things that really, if you're new to the country, you don't understand the cultural context of things, that messes them up. So you have to really start thinking. There's a great book by Richard Lederer from the University of New Hampshire called Anguished English that has a gazillion of those. And so if you're ever really depressed about teaching, get that book and read it. It's hilarious, hilarious. All right, so that's your domains. And we'll just move right along here. Pretty much. Okay, other features that you need to know. Automaticity, these are pretty obvious ones. This is on the things. And fluency again. Metacognition, everybody knows about metacognition? Do you or not? It's okay not to know. We'll find that professor who didn't teach you this. Metacognition is just I know what I know. And I know how I know it. But not only that, I can tell you. You know, it's not just in my head. I can tell you. I can tell you what I know and how I know it. And then schema, of course, is having a wealth of information about a lot of different things. And you've got those file folders. I always use the example in my classes of restaurants. If I say restaurant, everybody sorts through. They eliminate cars and malls and clothing. And get okay, restaurant. And then if I say Italian restaurant, then now you start. Okay, it's spaghetti, it's calzones. So you have started to refine down from a very large schema to a very small schema. And your brain does this in a nanosecond, just by hearing the word. How many of you do crossword puzzles in here? By the way, great way to get your kids' vocabulary built up. Great way. And there's one of those crossword builders So you just take your vocabulary words from your subject, and then it will build it for you. I've forgotten that some. Do you know which one it is?
It's online.
It's online. Just look up Crossword Builder.
You can do it on Puzzle Maker, puzzlemaker.com. It has lots of
Okay.
puzzles, but
And
Crossword
I used to print them out on those great sheets of paper and put one on the board every week, and then we would do them. And great way to raise SAT scores, ACT scores, etc. Praxis scores, GRE scores. Okay, so helps you with that schema building thing. Then we talked about evaluation. This are some of the things. I think we're going to skip this part. This is all done for you. These are the ways, these are the ways we test everything. Well, at least until the next report comes out, we might change that too. All right, good job. Thank you. Pat yourself on the back. Questions? Comments? Answers? I don't have any. No questions? They're all brain dead, Dr. Carroll. I ruined them for life. I put too much information in one day.
What do you see when you're, for instance, when you go around and see student teachers now, what kinds of practices work best across the content area for infusing literacy in, say, social studies and those kinds of classrooms?
Good question. The thing I'm seeing that's, to me, the most exciting is the team interactions, where they're working to do cross-subject projects and things like that. So, for instance, science goes in with history, and they do the history of science. How did it develop? Was Galileo a real person? That kind of thing. And so they start exploring across the content areas. Those, to me, are the things that are working. But here again, a lot of teachers, and I'm not recommending this for brand new teachers unless you've got a team that you start off with in your new career that is really gung-ho, because you've got a lot of things to learn and to do hitting the ground running. Just to get used to the culture of school is different than the culture of being in school, right? Being a student as opposed to teaching students. So I'm not in any way suggesting you go in and just gung-ho tell your English department chair, you're only going to read James Joyce, and we're going to read aloud every day. So I'm not trying to say that at all. What I am trying to say is that there are ways in which you can address motivational issues with students by using good literature in a way in which kids will engage with it. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? This is others just a bunch of fluff for the professors. No. All right? Good question. What? I can see it. What do you want? It's okay. We're all friends here. You can ask questions or make statements. Or not. Yes.
I have some of my students are here today, and I think they're wondering, thinking about teaching first or sixth grade mathematics, do you have any suggestions on resources or techniques for introducing mathematical ideas to non-native speakers?
Non-native speakers, right. We had this question in a similar way yesterday, what kinds of materials I would use. I'm assuming that when they come to a regular classroom, that they have receptive vocabulary. Okay, I make that assumption. And the reason I do is because think about how you as a mom would teach a new child. You wouldn't just say, okay, I'm only going to give you the sounds today. No, mothers would never do that. But for some strange reason, that's what we think we have to do in schools. Right? But moms talk to their kids all day. They sit and read with them. They read things aloud as they're doing things themselves. So by the time most kids get to schools, they know about literacy, right? They know those kinds of things. The sounds are already there. They just need the connection between what's written and what they hear. Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to speak to you if they didn't have the sounds, right? Does everybody get that? I mean, here again, I think I'm minimalizing this, and it seems so obvious, but people made wars out of this, so I must be missing something, right? But if those second language learners come to you, or English language learners are coming to you, in a regular classroom, if they have no or limited receptive language, you need to find them a place where they can be in a bilingual situation, or somebody can come in and work with them, because it's not that you can't accommodate them, but you've got to accommodate 29 plus 1 or 6.
I had a question. Would it be appropriate, let's say you get a 5th grade student who is very new to the country and has very limited opportunities to acquire those kinds of awarenesses. Would it be appropriate for them to kind of tutor in a kindergarten classroom
Yes.
where they're doing
Yes.
those kinds of activities?
Yes.
Because that is a gut level, that's what I think would be very appropriate, but it seems to be resisted
It is
by people.
in this country. In
Yes.
Australia and New Zealand, kids are blocked together until they're like in their 3rd form.
Yeah, that would make
And
more
that
sense.
accommodates that whole thing, because older kids are helping the younger kids. And if one is struggling even older, and it's a smarter, younger, or more knowledgeable younger kid, then they'll accommodate that. But it's because there's not that grade level stigma, another cultural stereotype. Oh, wait a minute, you're 8, you have to be. Right.
I work in a Title I school that also that very diverse, and we get a lot of OSU students and their children enroll in that school. And what we have come up with is have a newcomers classroom.
Yes.
And they spend probably half of the day in very intense instructions on content areas, especially building up vocabulary for math and subject areas.
Yes.
So it helps a little bit. And with math, I think it is much easier for them to understand, because numbers are
Yes,
numbers, no matter what language it
Right.
is.
Right.
So
It's in California, we did what we call two-way bilingual. Do you talk about two-way bilingual programs anymore? No? Well, that is really unfortunate, because it's a brilliant way, because you get brand new learners, you get strong English learners, and the brand new learner from whatever language, and they did it in 5 different languages in this one school I worked in. There would be one teacher and a teacher aide, or another teacher, if the school could afford it, that spoke the 2 target languages, so English and Japanese, or English and Spanish, or English and Chinese, or whatever. And so both groups of kids were learning the language, and you know how little kids are, they're like sponges. They just start absorbing it. So the second language learner, in either case, was, it was just a natural progression. I really find it, and I know this is true in Florida, we have a law against putting kids that don't have working receptive language in a grade in that class, in a regular classroom. They're supposed to be threaded through a bilingual at least for half a day. And it's unfortunate that, I guess, funding, and so I just tell teachers to do what you would normally do. Don't push them, let them come to the table, but make everything available for them. Make it available in audio, make it available in visual, so that they can see, because that's what you would do with a new speaker, right? If you had a brand new child, that's what you would do. Materials, if you've got a kid that's got a strong receptive language that's learning English for the first time, use your materials. Just make other accommodations, other kinds of materials appropriate. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, how many days do they have one language and not the other?
In the bilingual,
Yes.
they had each class, they would have half a day, or half of the class would be in the Spanish, and half of the class would be in the English. So for reading, they would read in Spanish, they would read in English. And for math, they would read in math, and they would read in English. Right? I mean, read in Spanish and math, and read in English and math. So if it was like a 40-minute block of time, 20 minutes would be, and 20 minutes would be.
Do you think it was hard for the students though to go back and forth in the languages?
No, they code switch very, very well.
Was there a cap to how old you had to be to get into these bilingual schools?
3rd grade.
Okay, because in Europe, I mean, I almost went to a bilingual school, but I was too old when I was there to even get in.
How old were
Most
you?
of them, I was 10. Yeah, but most schools put caps on it now, because once you're to a certain point, you can't code switch anymore.
Yeah.
So I just wondered.
They do. They did it K through 3. They were 3rd grade. They were trying to do their pre-K, but they didn't have enough people that could teach. And I said, well, bring in moms. You know, the mothers, they, you know, you're hiring assistants anyway, so you use mothers, it's a pre-K. You know, we're the only country, well, now I guess they all certify teachers, but in Australia and New Zealand, moms were the teachers.
Yeah.
You didn't have to have a master's degree in curriculum instruction.
With literacy, in Florida, have you found a way to stop the under or over-identification of English language learners with disabilities? Like speech and
Oh, I
language
know.
people, plus
Yeah.
ELL
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
plus, you know, I mean,
Great question.
have you stopped
Yeah.
to find a way? Because
Yeah.
that's what I'm interested in.
In New York, you were placed, I don't want to say New York's a bad place to work, it's not, it's a great place to work, but most schools, you were placed in a bilingual classroom because of your surname.
Right.
Not, I mean, you could speak perfect English, but if you were Martinez, you went to bilingual. I mean, we had Japanese students whose parents would come in and say, no, my child is not going to a bilingual class. Oh yeah, Yamamoto, you gotta go to, I mean, it was ridiculous. You know why that's the way it was? Coin of the realm. You got more money, your school's got much more dollars to have these bilingual programs and ELL programs.
But if they're put in the wrong place, if they're
Oh yes.
miscategorized as, you know, having a learning disability, or if they're not found to have a learning disability and they're just waiting on language acquisition, both groups of students end up behind.
Yes, absolutely. And reading too. And once you're labeled Title I, and I was a Title I, then a Chapter I, then a Book I teacher before we went back to Title I. Once you're labeled, that's carried almost all the way through your academic career. That's the problem with it. That's why I don't, I mean, how do you label a first grader a non-reader? Really and truly. Or disabled. What's her name? I'll have to get this book for you. It's, she wrote it about this kid in New York who was in kindergarten, and the teacher, honest to goodness, just made an observation. And she observed that the little guy just wasn't holding the scissors appropriately, and what ensued was a 4-year legal battle that they placed him in Title I because of his ability to use scissors. His parents fought the school system and had to a psychologist came in and said, well, you know, after 2 years, he's really behind, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course he is, because you now drug him out of school because you said he had inabilities and he was this, that, and the other, and blah, blah, blah. And this book is, I can't remember. I'll find it and I'll get it to you. So it's just a great story. The state of New York lost, finally, but this poor child, he was homeschooled after that. Because, and the state fought the parents on that, because they were hurting him. Wait, you've just taken him out of classroom hours for 4 years to put him in Title I, which he didn't need, and had a psychologist say that he was, and the psychologist had only seen him like 4 or 5 minutes. And they labeled this poor kid, Patrick was his name. Her name is Denise. I'll think of it when I'm old, so it, you know. But yeah, if we don't have a way of undoing. We just do first.
Well, there's the identification from gen ed teachers or from special ed teachers,
Right.
but there's no one particularly, like my background is for Spanish language, so there's no one qualified to do speech and language plus gen ed plus whatever target language it is, because unless you have all 3 of those skills, you're
That's
not
right.
going to place them correctly.
Right,
And there's
exactly.
no program for that.
That's exactly right. You'll be one of a kind. You can start a new trend. And we hope you do. Because even in Florida, we wouldn't have had appropriate English language instruction if it hadn't been for the Florida decree. They had to go to court to get teachers appropriately certified to teach the kids. I mean, that's not a good thing. But it's just a caveat for all of us. You know, that when we see a kid, don't jump to a conclusion, don't have an expectation that they're, you know, not, you know, they're not qualified to do that. I had a student tell me one time, because I said, this was another one of those bad examples. I said, you don't seem to be engaged in the classroom. She said, some of us percolate at different and I'm often reminded of that. And also, as my parting shot is that we are all gifted. We just open our packages differently. Thank you very much for your time.